It was the spring of 1901, and the town of Elmwood, a modest industrial outpost in upstate New York, carried on much as it had for decades. The Erie Canal still hummed with barges laden with coal and timber. Factories along the river produced everything from textiles to machinery. And beneath the rows of sturdy stone houses that lined Maple Street and the old Mill District, something quietly extraordinary was taking place. Workers arrived at dawn with horse-drawn carts, each one piled high with coarse, grey-white salt mined from the vast brine wells that had made this region famous since the 1790s. They pried open heavy wooden doors leading into the cool, vaulted stone basements that formed the foundations of nearly every home built before the Civil War. Then, load after load, they poured the salt inside, filling the spaces floor to ceiling, until 900 separate cellars had been transformed into solid blocks of crystalline reserve. By early summer, the operation was complete. The doors were resealed with fresh mortar, and the town simply moved on. Records from the Elmwood Town Hall, preserved in the county archives, note the event in a single ledger entry dated the 12th of April 1901. Salt Storage Initiative, Municipal Contract, 900 units. No further explanation. No public debate recorded in the Weekly Gazette. No protests from homeowners whose storage rooms, once used for root vegetables, cider barrels, and winter provisions, had been rendered inaccessible. What little contemporary mention exists comes from a passing line in a state agricultural report, suggesting the project was part of a larger effort to secure food supplies amid the rapid industrialization sweeping the Northeast. Yet even that document offers no details on cost, source, or purpose, and that silence, more than the act itself, is what lingers. To grasp why this might have happened, we must step back into the closing years of the 19th century, when salt was not merely a seasoning, but a strategic resource. America's salt industry had exploded after the Civil War. In upstate New York alone, annual production exceeded 2 million barrels by 1890, drawn from the same Onondaga brine springs that had supplied the Iroquois long before European settlement. The salt was essential for preserving meat, fish, and dairy in an era before reliable refrigeration. It hardened roads in winter, cured hides in tanneries, and fed the chemical plants that produced soda ash for glass and soap. Farmers and merchants alike understood its value. Stone basements, with their constant cool temperatures and natural humidity, had long served as ideal storage for perishable goods. But by 1901, the landscape was shifting. Railroads were connecting distant markets faster than ever. Large packing houses in Chicago and Cincinnati were centralizing food production. And in small towns like Elmwood, local self-sufficiency felt increasingly fragile. Some historians believe the decision to fill those 900 basements reflected a quiet anxiety about supply chains. The preceding decade had brought droughts, labor strikes, and the financial panic of 1893, which had shuttered banks and left store shelves empty for months. Records suggest that state officials, working through obscure agricultural extension programs, quietly encouraged communities to create emergency reserves. Salt, being non-perishable and naturally antimicrobial, would keep any stored provisions viable for years. Yet the scale 900 separate cellars, representing nearly every stone foundation in the old districts, remains striking. Why not a single centralized warehouse? Why disperse the effort so widely, and why do it without public notice? The answers, if they ever existed, have faded into the archives. What we do know is that the work was carried out with remarkable efficiency. A contract was awarded to the Syracuse Salt Company, whose ledgers from that year show a sudden spike in local deliveries, over 4,000 tons diverted from standard rail shipments. Workers were local men, paid in cash, sworn to no particular secrecy, but simply told the job was municipal priority. One surviving payroll slip, discovered decades later in a descendant's attic, lists names still familiar in Elmwood family trees: carters, masons, and day laborers who had built those very houses a generation earlier. They spoke little of the task afterward. Oral histories collected in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration contain only vague references the salt job in 01, as though the memory had been deliberately softened by time. And yet, beneath the surface, early signs had been there. In the winter of 1900, unusually heavy snows had collapsed several older barns and damaged root cellars across the county. Spring thaws revealed widespread mold and spoilage in stored crops. Farmers complained in letters to the Gazette that their winter supplies had rotted faster than usual, blaming the erratic weather patterns many attributed to the closing of the frontier and the loss of natural windbreaks. At the same time, reports from the U.S. Department of Agriculture noted a national uptick in foodborne illnesses linked to poor preservation methods. In Washington, officials were quietly urging states to improve storage infrastructure. Elmwood's response, if that is what it was, appears to have been both practical and unusually comprehensive. Still, the operation raised quiet questions even then. One elderly resident, a widow named Clara Henshaw, whose stone house on River Road contained one of the filled basements, wrote a private letter to her daughter in Boston, dated June 1901 and later donated to the local historical society. It reads, "They came and poured the salt until the floor disappeared beneath it. The men said it was for the good of the town, but they would not say why. I asked the foreman if we might keep a small space for our potatoes, and he looked at me as though I had suggested something foolish. The cellar is gone now, sealed like a tomb." Henshaw's words capture the unease many felt but few voiced aloud. The town's economy depended on the salt works. Questioning the project risked alienating employers and neighbors alike. By late summer, the filled basements had become part of the ordinary landscape. Children played on the streets above them, unaware that beneath their feet lay thousands of tons of salt, silent and waiting. Merchants continued to order smaller quantities for their shops, the canal boats still passed, and the larger world turned toward its own dramas. In September, President McKinley would be assassinated at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, just a short train ride away. The nation mourned, and Elmwood, like everywhere else, turned its attention outward. The salt in the basements was forgotten almost as quickly as the work had been completed. But that wasn't the strangest part. What happened next, in the years immediately following, began to suggest that the filling of those cellars was not an isolated measure, but the visible edge of something larger, something that touched the lives of ordinary people in ways they could scarcely have anticipated. Letters from the period, scattered across family collections, hint at a subtle change in daily routines. Housewives who once relied on their cellars for winter stores now turned to commercial canneries and rail-delivered goods. Farmers reported smaller personal gardens, as if the need for home preservation had suddenly eased. And in the town council minutes of 1902, there is a single cryptic reference to the salt reserve having served its preliminary function, followed by no explanation whatsoever. Historians who have examined the surviving documents offer differing interpretations. Some point to the rapid expansion of the national rail network, which by 1901 allowed fresh produce to reach even remote towns within days rather than months. Others suggest a coordinated state-level experiment in centralized food security, part of the broader progressive-era push for efficiency and preparedness. There is no clear consensus. What is certain is that the project left no visible trace on the surface of daily life. The stone houses stood unchanged, the river continued its slow course, and the salt remained, undisturbed, beneath the floors where families slept and children grew. One personal story, preserved in a memoir written decades later by a man named Thomas Riley, offers a glimpse into the human dimension. Riley had been a boy of 12 in 1901, living in a modest stone cottage on the edge of the mill district. His father, a saltworks laborer, had helped load the very carts that filled their own basement. Years afterward, Riley recalled the night the last load was poured. Father came upstairs covered in white dust, like a ghost. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at his hands for a long time. "It's done," he said, "and that's all we need to know." I asked him what it was for. He only shook his head and told me to go to bed. I never forgot the look in his eyes, part pride, part something heavier, as though he understood that the town had traded one kind of security for another. Such accounts are rare, yet they accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer. They suggest that the people of Elmwood accepted the change because it came wrapped in the language of progress and communal good. The early 1900s were a time of faith in experts, in government initiatives, in the idea that unseen hands could steer the future. No one questioned the salt because questioning it would have meant questioning the very forces reshaping their world. Yet, as the months turned to years, subtle cracks began to appear in that acceptance. By 1903, a few homeowners petitioned the council for permission to reopen small sections of their cellars, citing practical needs. The requests were denied without recorded reason. In 1904, a minor flood along the river damaged several foundations, and inspectors noted that the salt inside had remained dry and intact, forming a natural barrier against moisture. The Gazette reported the findings briefly, praising the foresight of municipal planning. But the article stopped short of explaining the original purpose. What they found next, however, would quietly shift the narrative. In the years that followed the filling of the basements, the salt industry that had defined the region for more than a century entered its final decline. Syracuse, long known as the Salt City, saw production dwindle as competition from larger operations in the Midwest. By 1905, many of the solar evaporation vats along the old canal routes stood empty, their wooden frames weathering in the sun. The vast Onondaga Salt Springs Reservation, once a state-managed enterprise that had produced millions of bushels annually, was winding down. Yet, in Elmwood, a smaller satellite community drawing from the same brine fields, the 900 filled basements remained untouched, a quiet counterpoint to the industry's retreat. Records suggest that the municipal authorities viewed the project as a form of insurance. With rail lines now carrying goods from Chicago's stockyards and California's orchards, local dependence on preserved foods was diminishing. But memories of the 1893 panic, when supply chains had fractured and prices had soared, lingered in the minds of town elders. Some historians believe the salt-filled cellars were intended not merely for storage, but as a stable, climate-controlled environment that could preserve emergency provisions should larger systems fail. The constant coolness of the stone foundations, rarely rising above 50 degrees even in summer, combined with salt's desiccating properties, would have created near-ideal conditions. Yet no surviving inventory lists what, if anything, was placed atop or within the salt layers before the final sealing. The ledgers remained silent on that point. What happened next began to shift perceptions in subtle ways. In the winter of 1906, a particularly harsh season brought ice storms that disrupted rail traffic for weeks. Store shelves in Elmwood thinned, and for the first time since the project, a few voices in the Gazette wondered aloud whether the town's municipal reserves might now prove useful. The council issued a brief statement affirming that the SALT initiative remained in place, but offered no details on access or distribution. The matter faded as the weather improved. Still, the episode planted a seed of curiosity among some residents. By 1908, the first tangible evidence of the salt's presence surfaced in an unexpected way. During routine foundation repairs on a house near the old mill, workers accidentally breached a small section of one basement wall. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Instead of loose piles, the salt had settled and partially recrystallized into a dense, almost monolithic mass, fused by moisture and time into a solid block that resisted picks and shovels. The town engineer's report, preserved in county files, noted the material's remarkable uniformity and lack of contamination. The reserve appears intact and stable, it concluded, before recommending the breach be resealed immediately. No public announcement followed. The Gazette carried only a short notice about minor structural maintenance on Maple Street. Personal stories from this period reveal the quiet human cost. Margaret Ellis, a schoolteacher whose family home contained one of the filled cellars, kept a diary that has since been archived by the local historical society. In an entry from March 1909, she wrote, "Mother still speaks of the day they took our cellar. We lost the last of the apple barrels and the root vegetables we had counted on. Now we buy everything from the grocer, and it feels as though part of our independence has been poured away with the salt. Father says it is progress. I wonder if progress always demands such quiet sacrifices." Ellis's words capture a broader sentiment. Many families had surrendered practical autonomy for the promise of collective security, yet the security itself remained abstract, never tested in a visible crisis. Multiple perspectives emerged even within the small community. Business owners, particularly those tied to the remaining salt works or the canal trade, tended to defend the project as forward-thinking. One merchant, interviewed years later for a WPA oral history, recalled, "We thought it wise at the time. The world was getting bigger, faster. Better to have something put by than to depend on trains that might not come." Farmers and working-class families, however, expressed more ambivalence. Their letters and reminiscences speak of lost storage space, higher reliance on cash purchases, and a subtle erosion of self-reliance that mirrored larger shifts in American life during the Progressive era. As the decade progressed, the SALT initiative seemed to fade further into the background. The town's attention turned to new factories, the arrival of electricity, and the promise of automobiles. Yet beneath the surface, the basements endured. Occasional leaks or minor earthquakes common enough in the region prompted quiet inspections. In each case, engineers reported the salt mass holding firm, sometimes even acting as a natural sealant against water intrusion. One 1912 inspection note, buried in municipal correspondence, observes that the crystalline blocks had developed a faint pinkish hue in certain cellars, likely from trace minerals in the original brine. The observation was noted without further comment, and that's when things began to shift once more. By 1914, with war looming in Europe, national conversations about food security and strategic reserves gained new urgency. The U.S. Department of Agriculture issued guidelines encouraging communities to review local storage capacities. In Elmwood, a discreet review was undertaken. What the inspectors found, or rather, what they did not find, raised fresh questions. Several basements, when probed through small access points, showed signs that portions of the salt had been disturbed at some point after the original filling. No official records documented any removal or redistribution. The discrepancies were minor, confined to a handful of sites, but they suggested that someone, at some time, had accessed the reserves without public knowledge. There is no clear consensus on who might have done so, or why. Town officials at the time attributed any variation to natural settling or minor undocumented maintenance. Historians examining the records today remain divided. Some see evidence of pragmatic, low-level use during lean years. Others view it as simple bureaucratic oversight. The escalation came gradually. In 1917, as America entered the Great War, food conservation campaigns swept the nation. Elmwood, like thousands of other towns, planted victory gardens and promoted canning. Yet behind closed doors, a small committee was formed to assess the viability of tapping the old salt reserves for emergency preservation efforts. Correspondence from that committee, later declassified in county archives, reveals internal debate. One member argued that reopening even a few cellars could provide critical capacity for drying and curing meat if shipping lanes were threatened by submarines. Another warned that disturbing the salt might compromise its long-term integrity. The meetings produced recommendations but no recorded action. The war ended before any large-scale mobilization of the reserves occurred. What doesn't add up, even now, is the complete absence of any follow-through documentation after 1918. The committee's files end abruptly. No inventory of contents, no distribution logs, no final report on the state of the 900 basements. It is as though the entire matter was allowed to recede once the immediate pressure of war lifted. Families continued their lives above the silent salt. New homes were built with modern basements, bypassing the old stone foundations altogether. The original cellars, for the most part, remained sealed. One particularly poignant account comes from a young soldier named James Whittaker, who returned from the trenches in 1919. In a letter to his sister, he described visiting his childhood home on Elm Street. The house stands as it always did, but the cellar is still a mystery. Father told me they filled it years ago for the town's sake. I asked if we could see it now that the war is over. He said the doors were never meant to be opened again. It made me think of the trenches holes in the ground we filled with our fear and our waiting. Perhaps some things are better left buried. Such reflections hint at the emotional weight the project had quietly assumed. For some, the filled basements symbolized prudent foresight. For others, they represented a loss of agency, a surrender to larger forces. The perspectives varied by class, by occupation, by generation. What united them was a shared reluctance to press the issue too forcefully. In a rapidly modernizing America, questioning municipal decisions risked being labeled backward or unpatriotic. The turning point arrived not with fanfare but with a quiet administrative decision in the early 1920s. Facing budget pressures and a desire to streamline town records, officials reclassified the Salt Storage Initiative as a completed historical project. Maintenance responsibilities were quietly transferred to a general facilities fund with minimal oversight. Inspections grew rarer. By the mid-1920s, most residents under the age of 30 had never heard detailed accounts of the 1901 operation. It had become local law, mentioned in passing during tours of historic homes or in stories told to children about the old days when salt was everything. Yet the salt itself had not vanished. It remained, ton upon ton, beneath the feet of a town that had largely moved on. The 1920s brought a wave of prosperity and forgetfulness to Elmwood. New roads were paved, automobiles appeared on the streets, and the old canal trade gave way almost entirely to rail and truck transport. The salt works that once defined the skyline were dismantled or converted into other industries. Young couples moved into modern bungalows with concrete basements and electric refrigerators. The stone houses of the old districts, with their filled foundations, stood as quiet relics admired for their architecture, but rarely discussed for what lay beneath. Real estate listings from the period described the homes as charming period properties with full cellars, omitting any mention of the salt that rendered those cellars unusable. Yet beneath the surface calm, the reserves endured. Occasional structural surveys, required for insurance or property transfers, occasionally noted the presence of the salt mass. One 1927 engineering report for a house on Canal Street observed that the crystalline block had compacted further, forming a dense, rock-like consistency that actually strengthened the foundation against settling. The report recommended no action. Similar findings appeared in scattered municipal files through the early 1930s, always phrased in neutral, technical language. There is no indication that anyone proposed reopening the cellars on a larger scale. The salt had become part of the infrastructure itself, invisible, uncontroversial, and largely unremembered. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, might have been the moment when the purpose of the 1901 project was finally tested. Unemployment soared, food prices fluctuated wildly, and many families in Elmwood struggled to feed themselves. Victory gardens reappeared, and soup kitchens operated in church basements. Some historians believe this was the period when limited, undocumented access to the salt reserves may have occurred. A handful of oral histories collected in the late 1930s mention rumors of municipal salt being distributed for home curing during the worst years. One former resident recalled his father returning home with a small sack of coarse salt from the town stores to preserve a pig slaughtered in secret. These accounts are fragmentary and uncorroborated by official records. What happened next remains unclear. No ledgers document any systematic withdrawal. If the salt was used, it was done quietly, perhaps by local officials acting on their own initiative to prevent hardship without drawing attention to the original project. Personal stories from the Depression era add layers of quiet poignancy. Eleanor Vance, a widow raising 3 children in one of the old stone houses, kept a meticulous household ledger that survived in family papers. In 1932, she noted the loss of her vegetable garden to early frost and wrote simply, "If only the old cellar were still ours, the salt they put there might have saved us much worry." Her neighbor, a retired canal worker named Samuel Graves, told his grandchildren years later that during the hardest winter he had dreamed of breaking through the basement floor just to see if the salt was still there, like a promise the town had made and then forgotten. Such memories suggest the emotional resonance the filled basements retained for those who remembered 1901 firsthand. For the younger generation, however, the story had faded into vague local legend. Multiple perspectives clashed during these years. Town officials, facing budget shortfalls, prioritized immediate relief over revisiting old infrastructure projects. Progressive reformers saw the SALT initiative as an outdated relic of pre-refrigeration thinking. Local historians, beginning to document the town's industrial past, mentioned the 1901 filling only in passing, usually as an example of community resourcefulness during an earlier era of uncertainty. There was little appetite for deeper investigation. The salt remained sealed, its potential utility untested on any documented scale. Escalation came slowly with the approach of another global conflict. By 1938, as war clouds gathered in Europe and Asia, the federal government once again turned its attention to strategic reserves. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration and civilian defense planners encouraged communities to review local food storage capacities. In Elmwood, a quiet survey was conducted in 1940 under the auspices of the newly formed Office of Civilian Defense. Inspectors visited a sample of the old stone houses. What they discovered was both reassuring and puzzling. In most cases, the salt mass remained largely intact, though some settling and minor dissolution had occurred along edges exposed to trace moisture. A few cellars showed small voids or irregularities that suggested previous minor access. The survey report, declassified decades later, noted the reserve's continued viability for emergency preservation, but recommended against large-scale reopening due to structural risks and the availability of modern canning and freezing technologies. Once again, the findings stayed within administrative channels. No public announcement was made. The turning point arrived in the early 1940s, amid the full mobilization for World War II. Rationing of sugar, meat, and canned goods placed new pressure on households. In Elmwood, as elsewhere, victory gardens expanded, and home canning became a patriotic duty. A small number of the old stone houses were quietly designated for auxiliary storage trials. Limited sections of 3 or 4 basements were carefully excavated under supervision. Workers found the salt still dense and effective, though mixed in places with decades of dust and minor debris. Small quantities were removed for testing in local community canning centers. The results were positive. The salt performed well for curing and pickling, yet the operation was kept low profile. Contemporary newspaper accounts mention only generic municipal storage enhancements without referencing the 1,901 origins. It appears that authorities preferred to avoid stirring questions about why such vast reserves had been created and then largely ignored for 40 years. What doesn't add up is the scale of the original project versus the minimal use made of it over 4 decades. 900 cellars filled to capacity represented an enormous investment of labor, material, and planning in 1901. Yet the documented withdrawals, whether during the Depression or the war, appear negligible by comparison. Some historians believe the salt was intended less as a practical stockpile and more as a psychological or symbolic reserve, a visible commitment to preparedness in an uncertain age. Others suggest bureaucratic inertia simply allowed the project to continue existing without purpose. There is no clear consensus. The evidence layers are thin, scattered engineering reports, a few personal letters, fragmentary oral histories. Each adds a piece but never completes the picture. As the war progressed, even these limited efforts tapered off. By 1943, with Allied victories shifting the momentum, the focus moved to post-war planning. The old stone basements returned to their silent state. Some were resealed more permanently with concrete caps. Others were simply left as they were, their contents undisturbed for another generation. The collapse, or rather, the disappearance of attention to the project, came swiftly after 1945. With peacetime abundance, cheap refrigeration, and the rise of supermarket chains, home food preservation lost its urgency. The salt industry itself had long since moved on. Synthetic chemicals and imported salt from other regions had rendered the old brine wells obsolete. In Elmwood, the remaining salt works closed for good in the late 1940s. The town reinvented itself around light manufacturing and tourism, centered on its historic canal district. The filled basements became, at best, a footnote in local guidebooks. Interesting example of early 20th century municipal planning. By the 1950s and 1960s, most of the original stone houses had been subdivided or converted into apartments. New owners, often unaware of the history, complained occasionally about dampness or strange crystalline deposits in utility rooms. Maintenance crews sometimes encountered the salt when digging for pipes or wiring. One 1,958 incident involved a plumber who broke through a thin wall and described hitting a solid wall of salt, like mining into a glacier. The story circulated locally as a curiosity, but prompted no broader inquiry. The town's historical society received a few inquiries from amateur researchers, but the available documents offered little beyond the original ledger entry and scattered maintenance notes. Modern re-examination began in earnest during the 1970s and 1980s, as interest in industrial archaeology and local history grew. Scholars from nearby universities visited Elmwood to study the canal era and the salt industry's decline. A few graduate theses touched on the 1901 project, analyzing it within the context of progressive era reform and early food security efforts. One researcher, Dr. Helen Whitaker, no relation to the earlier soldier, gained limited access to several basements in 1982. Using core samples and non-invasive imaging, she documented the salt's remarkable preservation still largely pure, with only minor contamination after 80 years. Her report suggested the original brine had been of unusually high quality, possibly from a specific, now depleted spring. Yet even Whitaker noted the absence of any clear rationale for the scale or the long-term neglect. The project appears both ambitious and enigmatic, she wrote. It reflects the era's faith in planning, yet its ultimate purpose remains elusive. In the decades that followed, further studies added layers but few definitive answers. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in the 1990s confirmed that the majority of the 900 cellars still contained dense salt deposits. A handful had been partially emptied during later renovations or collapsed due to neglect. Environmental testing showed no significant leaching of salt into the surrounding soil or groundwater, suggesting the stone foundations had contained the material effectively. Historians continue to debate the motivations. Was it a genuine attempt at regional resilience in the face of industrialization's uncertainties? A quiet experiment in decentralized storage that was never fully activated? Or simply an overzealous response to temporary anxieties that outlived its context? Today, Elmwood is a quiet town of preserved historic districts and suburban sprawl. Many of the original stone houses still stand, their filled basements hidden beneath updated flooring and modern utilities. A small exhibit in the local museum displays a core sample of the 1901 salt, alongside photographs of the old works and canal barges. Visitors occasionally ask about the story. The docents explain what is known, acknowledge what remains unknown, and leave the rest to imagination. What happened in the spring of 1901, and why the town chose to fill 900 stone basements with salt without broader explanation, continues to resist a single, tidy conclusion. The records suggest careful planning and communal effort. Personal stories reveal quiet acceptance mixed with private doubt. The evidence layers show a project that endured far longer than its apparent utility. And the open questions about access, purpose, and ultimate fate linger like the salt itself, dense, stable, and still present beneath the surface of everyday life. Some historians believe the initiative reflected a deeper anxiety about the fragility of modern supply chains even at the dawn of the American century. Others see it as a footnote in the long transition from local self-sufficiency to national interdependence. There is no clear consensus. The salt remains, for now, where it was placed more than a century ago, waiting, perhaps, for a future moment when its presence might once again be questioned or needed.